The Vietnam War, the war America couldn't win. 10 to 15-minute 2D animated history documentary script. Opening, midnight to 1 o'clock. Narrator, imagine fighting a war where the enemy is almost impossible to see. You are surrounded by thick jungle. The heat is unbearable. Every path could hide a trap. Every shadow could conceal a soldier. And sometimes the enemy doesn't attack at all. They simply disappear. For more than a decade, the United States fought a brutal and complicated war in Vietnam. America had some of the most powerful military technology on Earth. Jet aircraft, helicopters, artillery, thousands of soldiers. But Vietnam was not a conventional war. The United States could win battles, yet still lose the war. So how did America become involved in Vietnam? Why was the conflict so difficult to win? And how did a superpower eventually leave the country? This is the story of the Vietnam War. Chapter 1. A Country Divided. 1 to 210. To understand the Vietnam War, we have to go back before American troops arrived. After World War II, Vietnam was fighting for independence from French colonial rule. Vietnamese forces led by Ho Chi Minh fought the French in a long conflict. In 1954, the French suffered a major defeat at Dien Bien Phu. France eventually withdrew, but Vietnam was not united. The country was temporarily divided near the 17th parallel. In the north was the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh. The communist government wanted to reunify Vietnam under its control. In the south was the Republic of Vietnam, supported by the United States and its allies. The division was supposed to be temporary, but the planned nationwide elections never took place. Instead, Vietnam became another major battlefield of the Cold War. The United States feared that if Vietnam became communist, other countries in Southeast Asia might follow. This fear became known as the domino theory, and America decided that Vietnam could not be allowed to fall. Chapter 2. America enters the conflict. 210 to 320. At first, the United States did not send hundreds of thousands of combat troops. Instead, American involvement grew slowly. Military advisors were sent to help train and support South Vietnamese forces. Weapons and equipment flowed into South Vietnam. But the communist forces continued to grow stronger. One of the most important groups fighting South Vietnam was the Viet Cong. They operated throughout South Vietnam and often used guerrilla tactics. They knew the countryside, they knew the villages, and they could disappear into the local population. The United States faced a difficult question. How do you defeat an enemy who doesn't need to hold a traditional battlefield? Then, in 1964, an event in the Gulf of Tonkin dramatically changed America's involvement. The Johnson administration said American ships had been attacked by North Vietnamese forces. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It gave President Lyndon B. Johnson much greater authority to expand military operations. Soon, American involvement would become a full-scale war. Chapter 3. The Jungle War. 320 to 445. By the mid-1960s, American combat forces were arriving in Vietnam in enormous numbers. Helicopters became one of the defining symbols of the war. They could carry soldiers deep into the jungle. They could evacuate wounded troops. And they could move supplies across difficult terrain. American aircraft dominated the skies. But on the ground, the situation was very different. The jungle was dense. Roads were limited. The weather was brutal. And the enemy rarely fought the kind of battle American commanders expected. Viet Cong fighters used ambushes. They built underground tunnels. They placed hidden traps. They attacked quickly and disappeared before American forces could respond. American soldiers could capture a village one day, only to discover that enemy fighters had returned later. This created one of the central problems of the war. The United States was trying to measure success through enemy casualties and military operations. But there was no clear front line. There was no single city that could be captured to end the war. The battlefield was everywhere and nowhere. Chapter 4. The War from the Sky. 4:45 to 6 o'clock. America's military power was enormous. American aircraft launched thousands of bombing missions against North Vietnam. The goal was to destroy military infrastructure, supply routes, and industrial targets. One of the most important supply networks was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was a massive network of roads and paths running through parts of North and South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. North Vietnamese forces used it to move soldiers and supplies south. The United States tried repeatedly to disrupt the network. Aircraft bombed roads and bridges. Helicopters carried troops into remote areas. Artillery struck suspected enemy positions. But the supply system was extremely difficult to destroy. When one road was damaged, another could be repaired or created. The jungle provided natural cover, and North Vietnam continued sending men and supplies south. America had superior technology, but technology could not easily solve a political and guerrilla war. Meanwhile, the human cost was growing. Thousands of American soldiers were being killed. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers were also dying. And back home in the United States, something was beginning to change. Chapter 5. America turns against the war. 6 to 7:15. At the beginning of the war, many Americans supported the government's policy. But as casualties increased, public opinion began to shift. Television brought the war directly into American homes. For the first time, millions of people could watch disturbing images of a distant war almost every night. Students protested. Veterans questioned the war. Families feared receiving devastating letters from Vietnam. Mass demonstrations spread across American cities and college campuses. The question became louder: why are American soldiers fighting and dying in Vietnam? The government faced another problem. Official statements often sounded more optimistic than the reality shown on television. This created a growing credibility gap. Then came the event that shocked America: the Tet Offensive. Chapter 6. The Tet Offensive. 7:15 to 8:35. In January 1968, Communist forces launched a massive series of attacks across South Vietnam. The offensive happened during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, known as Tet. American and South Vietnamese forces were caught by surprise. Cities were attacked. Military bases came under assault. Even areas considered relatively secure were suddenly threatened. One of the most dramatic battles occurred in the ancient city of Hue. Fighting continued for weeks. Eventually, American and South Vietnamese forces regained control. Militarily, Communist forces suffered enormous losses. But politically and psychologically, Tet was a turning point. Many Americans had been told that victory was getting closer. Instead, television showed enemy forces attacking cities across South Vietnam. The perception of the war changed. The question was no longer simply, can America win? It became, how long can this war continue? President Johnson eventually announced that he would not seek another term as president. The United States began searching for a way out. Chapter 7. Vietnamization. 8:35 to 9:45. When Richard Nixon became president in 1969, his strategy began to change. He called it Vietnamization. The idea was simple. American forces would gradually withdraw, while South Vietnamese forces would take greater responsibility for fighting the war. But the conflict did not immediately become smaller. The United States continued major military operations and air campaigns. The war also expanded into neighboring countries, particularly Cambodia and Laos, where parts of the communist supply network operated. The fighting continued, and American soldiers kept coming home. Some returned wounded. Others returned to a country deeply divided over the war. The military draft became one of the most controversial parts of American life. For many young Americans, the possibility of being sent to Vietnam was a constant fear. The anti-war movement continued growing. And then, in 1973, the United States reached a major